Thank you, Sean. It's a great pleasure for me to give a distinguished lecture. It's certainly a distinguished audience that we have here. And I'm very pleased to do this the lecture in CIRMMT, a center which I've seen practically born and growing. And it's now a major center in musical research and in research for musical creation. Of course, Canada, especially Quebec, has a very glorious history about, in particular, sound synthesis was really pioneered by Norman McLaren. And I recently read text about, from McLaren about his first experiments, and they are very premonitory about, all the considerations that are valid for sound synthesis with the computer. Also, of course, Hugh Kane was a major pioneer in electronic music. And the reason I put the perception in the center of my talk is because here we have a major school. The leader is Albert Bregman. I'm very pleased to see here, and who had very illuminating ideas yesterday about this on the seminar about illusions. And of course his group, among them, of course, Steve McAdams and others. Now, I will speak indeed about perception and the fact that using a technology, powerful technology like the computer, it's really more than the computer is not really a tool. François Bell likes to say it's like a workshop in which you can build all kinds of tools, be they intellectual or material, deal with sound as well as on logic of composition. And but perception is very important. I will explain briefly why, but somehow I will not deal exclusively with this issue, because to some extent I would like not to introduce the concept of tomorrow, but present some techniques, some protocols that have been taken advantages for the pieces that will be played tomorrow. And in some sense, I hope that they will also, the piece in the concept might illustrate some things I say in my talk, because talking about music is somehow like talking about the taste of orange as compared to tangerine. It's, of course, the proof of the cake is in the eating, as they say, not in the recipe. And this is very true for computer synthesis. Now, why computer synthesis? Well, let me say briefly something about history. Okay, around, I guess, around 1875, two inventions changed our relationship to the sound. Before, you had to build a vibrating machine or use a vibrating machine like our larynx or, a table, or an instrument like the piano with thousands of parts. And you knew the cause by listening to the quality of the sound that referred to the origin. And of course, that was causality from the sound. And when recording came in about 1875, when then it was not necessary to break a glass to hear the tone of a broken glass, to hear the sound of a broken glass. Causality became different. And then also we could study the sound as an object, reverse it in time, whereas because it's applied on space where symmetry applies, but time, of course, has its arrow. And also, the telephone used the microphone and loudspeaker that sort of converted the sound to electrical waves and vice versa, which meant that the electrical technology could be used to deal with sound rather than simply mechanical constraints. And that meant a lot. And as you know, in the 19th century, there was a patent of Thaddeus Kyle that built, excuse me, why is this? That built a sound dynamo using the electrotechnical developments of the dynamo to make sound. Dynamophone, it's what called, or also telharmonium, because it could be propagate the harmonies along telephone wires. Now, but this was used for traditional music to broadcast it along the telephone lines. Now, the electronic age came with the triode lamp by Lee de Forest. Lee de Forest was really interested in using electrical vibration to make music. And he did eventually build an electronic instrument, the predecessor of the theremin. And, but that was mostly sold as an instrument to play transposition of songs and or violin. Except Edgar Varèse, who was very stimulated by the event of electrical sound. Edgar Varèse used it in his piece Equatorial in 1933 as a manifesto, as a matter of fact, because at the end you only hear two theremin initially doing glissandi to very shrill frequency. So this is out of the well-tempered scale, and these are electronic sounds that ended the piece as though it was pointing toward the future. Now, it's only actually, with a few exceptions, like Cage Electronic Imaginary Landscape #1 in 1939, but musique sur support, as we say in French, and I think that's a Canadian origin word, recorded music, I mean music existing on tape, as was said before, that is not being performed, but existing already composed, and the sounds were composed on a recording medium. And that was really developed for original creation of music after the Second World War, when Pierre Schaeffer in Paris used recorded sound and radio studio techniques to assemble, to modify the sound and assemble them. Initially used sounds with obvious identity, like this Étude au chemin de fer, railway. And well, I will stop there just to give an idea. And at the same time, electronic music was developed in a completely different aesthetic context in Cologne and Munich, because the idea of the composer there, like Heimer, Stockhausen, Goye-Wertz, etc., it was to make a precise realization of very complex scores that were done in advance and that were so complex with the multi-serial compositional protocol that it was really very difficult to play accurately. So the idea was not at all the same. There was a big conflict between these two aesthetic schools, one more empirical, the other one more formal, you would say. And by the way, the digital age came afterwards for music. Computer composition was pioneered by Leharon Hiller, and there he used the computer to compose the sound based on certain rules of choice and exclusion. And the year after, 1957, Max Matthews, who is here playing a novel instrument that he made, Max Matthews realized the first sound synthesis and also the first digital recording, which are now, of course, very popular in CDs. But at that time, you couldn't engrave CDs like today because the laser had not yet been invented. So the technology was very expensive and cumbersome, but the principles that he developed there are still valid and important. He said, he wrote in an article published in Science in 1963, there are no theoretical limitations to the performance of the computer as a source of musical sounds, in contrast with to the performance of ordinary instrument. Now, I happened to read this article, and completely independent, I was in Paris then, and trying to find my own way. I had studied piano and composition, and my first pieces were for instrument and orchestra, but I was very interested in timbre. And when I had the first orchestral performance, I was both delighted at the richness of this resource, but also that it was very dated in that you couldn't really arrange the orchestra as you wanted, and the orchestra had habits. Now there are wonderful orchestras that will play practically anything, but and I was looking for some novel way to renovate the material, perhaps, of music, the vocabulary, you might say, renovate the vocabulary of music rather than the syntax, which seemed to be the aim of, for example, the serial school with Schoenberg, Babbitt, Boulez. But some others were interested in renovating the sound, and certainly Varèse was one of those, and he always longed for new materials, and he said new material permits new architecture for music as well as new material permit new structures, I should say, and this applies to music as well as to architecture. Well, now I read this article, and I was fortunate to be able to, shortly after, go work with Max Matthews to help develop the musical resources of these possibilities of computer synthesis that were then still virtual. They were not in completely available at all. It happened, by the way, that John Chowning was in California, and someone brought him this article, and this also was a complete change for him, and he decided to try to do electronic music with the computer. Now, the difference is I had musical training, but also scientific training. John Chowning didn't have scientific training initially. He learned everything, and he became, he developed powerful techniques and powerful music, and also scientific knowledge about, as maybe I'll have time to explain briefly. Okay, now you can see that Varèse was interested because as soon as 1959, he had a carte blanche in Greenwich Village where he lived, and so he put on the program Gutmann computer music. Varèse, c'est le computer. Say that was a very good word. He presented this, a very preliminary, and you might say primitive, piece done at Bell Labs with the first version of the music programs by Max Matthews. Music programs, they are programs to synthesize sounds, that is to calculate the wave as a function, of course, of the information you want to give to the program, that is giving the program the desired physical structure of the sound. Of course, you cannot tell the computer, I want a nice sound, I want a sound that's glossy or raspy. You have to indicate precisely the physical structure, and then the computer will realize it, just like a building enterprise will build a house or a building from the architect's blueprint. So now, as I said, sound now escapes causality, but research is needed to take advantage of the musical potential of computers, because while if you try to make a sound with a given physical structure, well, you can be very well surprised, and more often than not, unpleasantly surprised with the result, because orally it sounds very, very poor. I forgot to say that when I was a student, I, of course, was not really very attracted with either musique concrète or electronic music, because it seemed to me, at least, that musique concrète used a very rich vocabulary of sound, but the personality of those sounds was so strong with respect to the ductility you could exert on them. The transformations were very primitive, and so it was very difficult to escape an aesthetic of collage. That was my impression, at least, so I sort of stayed away from it. And also the electronic music seemed to me more controlled, but very dull. I remember Moulton Feldman said that, to me, electronic sounds are like a bold woman. Anyway, that's personal. Now, let me explain about sounds and perception. For example, these are wave shapes. That is, this is, you know, the shape of the, for example, the groove on the vinyl record. These look very different, but they really sound the same. They have the same power spectrum, but they have different phase relation. I'm not saying that phase is irrelevant. It depends what you call phase. But in that case, you have very powerful differences visually, but no difference orally. So you see, we are a little lost in this. And I like to say that Pierre Schaeffer, the inventor of musique concrète, said always that la musique est faite pour être entendue. Music is meant to be heard. It's the oral result that counts. That is the relation that your brain establishes between the percept that are elicited by physical objects of different physical parameters. But it's not the relation between the physical parameters that counts. This goes back to very far long ago, when Pythagoras was saying that numbers rule the world, because he was struck by the fact that musical intervals was ruled by simple ratios, preferred musical intervals, like the fifth was 3:2, whereas later Aristoxenus, who was called Aristoxenus a musician, said the justification of music is in the ear, not in a mathematical rationale. Well, I guess Aristoxenus was right, because we will hear 4 pairs of sine waves with frequency ratio 3:2, and you will hear that the last one can hardly be termed the fifth or any registered interval, as a matter of fact. So that's a fifth. That's a fifth. 1 octave higher, that's a fifth. What about this? It's very hard to say. The capacity of the ear collapses to really appreciate intervals beyond about 4 to 5,000 hertz. And so it's the ear that decides. It's not the numbers, finally. Okay, now, with the possibility of synthesizing the sound with computers, I should say here that some music programs, in particular the series of music programs by Max Matthews, were extremely helpful to put order in this, because they were modular. And you didn't have to have all options at the beginning. You had modules that you could assemble and make a construction of sound that you could choose the complexity of it, but it is by putting together a small number of elements that you could sort of reach any great variety of sound. The modularity is, of course, at work in speech with phonemes, or in chemistry with the chemical elements, and the linguist would say in languages as well. But in that case, it was very useful. But now, the problem remained to understand, to some extent, some useful way, the relation between the physical structure of the sound, as you can build it with the computer synthesis, and the perceived effect. For example, I will play a tone of a sine wave, a periodic tone with 10 harmonics of the same amplitude, constant amplitude. And frequency 55 hertz, a low A on the piano, not the lowest. Then the same mixed with 7 similar sounds with a frequency difference shifted by 1/20th of a hertz, which corresponds at this frequency of 50 to 1/60th of a semitone. Now, what do you think you will hear? Single tone, sorry. Well, I'm repeating this practical joke. I'm sure that you all know in advance because of this relation. because the sum of two sine waves can also be viewed as a product of two sine waves with a frequency which is average, about the same, and a very low frequency corresponding to this small difference between the two neighboring frequencies. This is a phenomenon of beat. But nevertheless, it's not quite obvious to me, at least, to predict that this structure will sound like this. What happens is that there are beats of different rates. The difference of 1/20th of a hertz means that in 20 seconds, the fundamental will go swell and decay, dwindle. And then the 10th harmonic, the difference is then not 20th of a hertz, but half a hertz, which means in 2 seconds it will wane and wax, and with lesser frequencies for the lesser harmonics, etc. So you see, even though is it physical or mathematical? In fact, it's the ear which decides, once again, that we will hear this. This is a mathematical identity. It's always true. It's a different way to represent the same functions, but it's the ear that decides to hear those two frequencies either as a chord, two sounds, or as this unique modulated sound. Well, if, for example, when I have 9 sine waves with a frequency difference of 3 hertz, constant amplitude, what you will hear is this. Because of the beat. The beat, of course, is used by piano tuners, but in that case, you can do extraordinarily precise frequencies, and so you can do beats or very complex beat, complex structures, I mean, complex sounding structures, not necessarily harmonic like this, with relatively simple physical descriptions. Okay, now, again, to emphasize the difference between physical frequency and perceived pitch, well, I'll play 2 tones and ask you which one you think the higher and by how much. Now, most listeners hear the first tone a little higher by about a semitone. If anyone disagrees, but physically, I go from the first sound to the second sound by going up an octave physically. That is, I double the frequencies, and the final result seems to have a lower pitch. Well, I'll do a little demonstration on the piano, but I want to anticipate on this to explain a little bit how this happens. And it's sleeping. Fractals. Okay, this is, by the way, this is a piece that I'll... Okay, now, when I play a C, the program will add many notes separated from this lowest note by 1 octave plus a semitone. So that's C sharp, D, D sharp, E natural, etc. So you might say this is a fractal because it behaves the same way in every part of the range. Except when I go up 1 octave. Well, that's quite natural because if you have I have a C, C sharp, D. When I go up 1 octave, the C sharp is replaced by the C. Now, on the whole octave, the D is replaced by the C sharp, and so on and so forth. So locally, there is a descent, even though globally there is an ascent. But it's the ear that decides on its strategy to evaluate, compare the pitches. So, and I have, and by the way, this is interesting. I think Sarah Lehman played from here, played the Ligeti concerto, and Ligeti told me was very interested in trying to make the piano, tuned normally, sound like it were non-tempered. And this is a case when you use this admittedly perhaps not very euphonious kind of tones, fractalized tone, the fact is that, you see, when I go up one octave, so the octave is not a self-similarity interval in that case. It's the octave plus a semitone. That's self-similar. So if I go up the chromatic scale, so I go up one octave in 13 steps. So that's a kind of trick to achieve this non-tempered division. And in fact, it does sound to me a little bit like certain ways that Ligeti has managed to do that. Now, so you can see that indeed the physical frequency, which is measurable, is not always isomorphous to the perceived pitch, which is percept, which is an auditory experience, and by which you compare on the scale of pitch, which is well familiar, but although not simple. It's like time for St. Augustinus. It's familiar, but to define it in a complete way is not so simple. Now, an example that perhaps even worse, I have two series of beats, and do you hear it faster in the first part of the example or the second part? And I'll play these two parts twice. More subtle, but let's see again. Well, to most listeners, the second part is a little slower. I don't know if anyone disagrees. But physically, I go from the first example to the second by doubling the speed of the tape recorder, thereby multiplying all frequencies by 2 and all rates by 2. So clearly, the chronometric rate is not simply the way to perceive rhythm. Things are more complex, and this has to do a lot with stream segregation that was specially studied and understood as an important way to perform auditory scene analysis by Albert Bregman in particular. That's a very strong way to organize an ensemble of sounds by your hearing, auditory scene analysis, and this stream segregation that makes, for example, I don't need the screen here. I play oh, I'm sorry. I have two lines. Well, there is one line, but if I play fast enough, so this is a way to organize an ensemble of sounds in various lines or streams, and this is very important to attach, in particular, certain sounds to a same mechanical origin. Well, when I say mechanical, I'd say the same physical source. Now, this, okay, now there was also a difficulty with imitating the instrument. You might say if you can do any sound of any physical structure, you just have to read the analysis of the instrument that is to be found in acoustic treatises and then just proceed to make sounds with this structure. And this doesn't always work in a very convincing way, like in this case here. Well, this is supposed to be a trumpet, and I guess you have to have a little imagination to really believe it. And in fact, so that was one of the first studies I did, analyze the trumpet. And you see, it's not really that simple. It's more complex, like there are many. Here, it's a scheme, a schema, a simplification of an analysis, harmonic by harmonic, of a trumpet tone of a quarter of a second. And you see, it's not that simple. Fortunately, in this complexity, there is one feature that is dominant for characterizing the trumpet for the ear. It's not the only one, but it's very important for characterizing the brass. The louder, the brighter. That is, when a horn plays louder, there are more high harmonics. The spectrum is really brighter. And this is very characteristic, especially since it happens even during the attack. And when the attack lasts 30 or 40 milliseconds, you can't really analyze it. You cannot really describe it exactly, but you recognize the pattern very clearly. And for example, this is clearly, I think it's a more suggestive synthesis. This one was done by Dexter Morrill. Etc. And okay, let me, of course, in that case, there was analysis of the trumpet and tried to boil down the description to the essentials that is for the ear, from the ear points of view, not from any mathematical criterion of least square difference with the wave, for example. And, well, you don't necessarily need to make analysis to make synthesis, either imitative or not. Like, for example, in the early 60s, I guess in 67, I tried to make up a bell sound without looking at any analysis. So I decided I would have synchronous inharmonic components, and with a decay, an attack and a decay. But I guess for you it will be more like this. Then the tail of the sound didn't sound natural. And so I had a faster decay for higher inharmonic components, and that was a little better, but not very lively. Then I put beats. And so we'll hear these three successive approximations or suggestions of a bell-like sound. The tail is not very natural. So this is a little more natural, and you have a little more life with the beats now. Now, this was done by program Music 5, which is a way to describe sounds, and it's a little hard to read, but it does have the advantage to have all the information on those sounds. For example, here I have frequency 224. Now it's 224 and 225, so there is a beat of 1 second, and there is all the duration, everything, so that 30 years after, I guess 40 years after, you can redo it, and you can pass the information, and so people can take this not as a model, but as a starting point, but already they sort of take advantage of some progress done in the description. And by the way, I will play a short example. I was always very struck by Varese, and in his poem Electronique, Varese had a bell. It was done in Holland. He had a difficult time with the Philips people, but he had recorded a beautiful bell, and he filtered it. And Vincent Verfaille, who was with Daniel Arfib and myself in Marseille, then he's now in Montreal. He did an analysis of this bell, and I took his information to generate the bell, variants of the Varese bell, which come at the beginning and the end of my piece, resonant soundscape that will be played tomorrow at the end of the concert. I'd like to play this this. So we will hear synthetic brass and Varese-like bells, but enriched in higher partials, and at the end it sort of go to its original form of very low frequencies only, but not very much in this passage. So let's see. Excuse me. Etc. So you see, this is a way to pass information and to share the know-how or the recipes, you might say. But of course, the recipe, as I said, you have to appreciate the tasting, and you can listen, of course. And so that's why I did at that time a catalog which had descriptions of the synthesis recipe, like so, and the example, and also the sound recording, and the kind of explanation. And there was a kind of economy of exchange. John Chowning, when he developed frequency modulation as a novel technique, he also gave the recipe in his first article published of the way to imitate a number of tones, harmonic, sustained, or inharmonic, like bells or drums. And that was extremely helpful to the community. Now, of course, when you imitate sounds, then you can think of having a relation with actual instruments and in a kind of chamber music, or contact between the real acoustic sound, which has identity very strong, and this computer sound, which have more flexible identities. And so this is a short passage of my passage, precisely, where the flute is playing together with a synthetic percussionist who doesn't hit anything, but who still produces sounds that remind of percussion instruments, probably. It's like a drum with bong, bong. Like a snare drum, perhaps a tom-tom, well. Etc. Okay, well, in a way that's using the computer synthesis to make ersatz, but the interesting thing is you can make instrument-like sounds that are different insofar, well, you can compose certain sounds which you couldn't really compose harmonically otherwise. Let me give the example of the piece Mutation, which we'll play at the beginning of the concert tomorrow, together at least with a film by Lillian Schwartz that was done after the music and for the music. It's an abstract film that shows various processes of making images, like synthesis by computer, but also growth of crystals in polarized light, and also diffraction of lasers in plastic, so they warm up the plastic a little, and so there are nice distortion and interferences. Anyway, so here I have a chord, arpeggiated, which becomes a chord, I mean a melody, then harmony, and then a timbre that's gong-like, but you can't really analyze the components, the pitches, but you can recognize that it is prolongating the harmony of the previous chords into timbre. So I think it's clear that the timbre is composed here like a chord, like the previous chord. And you can also make intimate transformations, for example, with the same kind of recipe of bells which I described. I have a kind of carillon with a number of different bell structure, harmonic structures. But then when I just change, attack, decay, and I just change this curve of envelope, amplitude envelope, as this more fluid one, then it becomes a fluid texture. It's like going from solids, individual bells, into some kind of liquid mass, but you can recognize still that the harmonic successions are the same. Now fluid. Now, John Chowning realized also gradual transition between timbres that you cannot normally do with instruments. You can do crossfade. But when you do a crossfade with images, you see that there are two images in between, two images. And with instrument of the orchestra, it's the same. You can superpose clarinet plus cello on the same pitch, but of course, in between, you hear clearly that there are two tones. Here, he transformed pebble-like, or say percussion-like tones without definite pitch into brass-like tones with definite pitch, but in a very gradual way. And in between, there is always a single sound object, single entity. Oops. Yesterday, we had a workshop here in McGill on auditory illusions organized by Catherine Costavino and with the presence of Albert Bregman, Steve McAdams, and others. And Albert Bregman wistfully remarked that what we call auditory illusions are often interpretations. Like when I said it's an illusion that when I double the frequency, the pitch will go down. The frequency doesn't go down if I double it clearly. But to think that it's an illusion when the pitch goes down if I double the frequency is only an illusion if you equate pitch to frequency. But pitch, it's a complex attribute, and so it's a paradox, you might say, because usually one thinks that the pitch goes along with frequency, but it's not properly an illusion. Certainly that's true. Now, the fact is that when you can compare with a physical stimulus, you can say that pitch is not frequency, and it's an illusion to assimilate it. Now, but I must say that our senses are only windows to the outside world. That transparency is illusory, it's a delusion, as you know from the well-known illusory figures, like this man is threatening, this one is not so much, but they have, of course, the same size. And perspective makes, well, that's partly that. I mean, and auditory perspective was, I would say, sort of started by John Chowning when he did his illusory source motions using the Doppler effect. Well, it's an illusion if you sense that the sound sources are moving, but the loudspeakers are fixed and they are not flying. But it's a way to make even an engine, a heavy engine, fly in a way that's kind of immaterial. So this is, of course, in that you sort of escape the mechanical constraints, and also, okay, well, for example, a recording that I made in a small room can be enlarged. That was Voilà. Okay, it's now gives the illusion that in spreading in a larger space now. Now, I myself was interested in pitch paradoxes, pitch circularity. Roger Shepard is well known for his endless chromatic scale, 12 steps of the chromatic scale that seem to go up or down endlessly when they are repeated. And Roger Shepard wrote in his 64 article that he couldn't produce it seemed impossible to produce the illusion with a continuous sound. It only took a little care to do this, and I was very motivated to do this continuous version because I wanted to illustrate a play. And the play was about the phantasmatic revival of the Hiroshima raid by one of the pilots. And there was a historical broadcast on the raid, and in fact, it was sort of dreamed by this Ederle, who was treated in a psychiatric hospital, and it was more a phantasmatic version than a real historical presentation. He sort of dreamed the broadcast, and so I was motivated to do both illusory ensembles, that is, ensemble of synthetic instruments that never really have no material counterpart, and also when in the play the bomb is launched, the pilot identifies himself with the bomb that was called Little Boy, code name, historical code name. So the psychiatrists say you're doing infantile regression, and but he falls. It's not really a fall, it's a mental collapse. So that's why this glissandi were appropriate. It's a kind of gliding without a bottom, anyway. So it has already gone back to the original point. Do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, si, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, etc. And so it can continue endlessly. And you can also do it going up with a richer spectrum. I'm sorry. Etc. These are all octaves that all go up, and they remain octave, but the amplitude emphasis in the medium range, so that new components can sort of sneak in and dwindle out on the other frequency end. This is some kind of analog drawn by Penrose, who Escher took this in one of his drawings. But probably the best analogy is more like this one. It really looks to go down toward the center, and these are circles. And so that's a similar phenomenon. This is a way to represent pitch in a more perhaps significant way than just a line of frequency. And you can do inverted helices. This is a circle, the endless glissandi. But I did also a sound that seems to go down the scale, but finish higher, like this stream of Escher. It goes down the scale, but it's obviously higher at the end. And you can do similar effect with rhythm, like Kenneth Knowlton first did, and I did the generalization. This is a sound that, well, I'll play just the beginning, goes down, but it becomes gradually higher. It also slows down locally, but it will be faster at the end. And it also seems to rotate. Well, I'll rather play a more recent version on a piece that I called Kaleidophone because it was built for an ensemble of, it was composed for an ensemble of 16 loudspeakers, sort of scattered through a big yard in Germany. And I call this Kaleidophone because it's a little bit like a kaleidoscope where the visual scene is sort of scattered in different places. And this is just the end of one of the movement where you have accelerandi, but also this similar phenomenon, but two at a time. I'm not sure. Well. Where is it? So there are two trajectories. So here there are only two loudspeakers. Tomorrow we shall have 16, and I think the effect will be rather different. These paradoxes, they can be achieved rather simply with the computer, where you can contrive the physical parameters very precisely, but also once you know your recipe, you can try to convince good performers to achieve it on instruments. For example, tomorrow Fabrice Barandola will play a piece called Nature contre Nature, trying to illustrate the rhythmic paradoxes, and that's very taxing on the performer. Also, Vivienne Spiteri will play a piece with specialization, and where, but there is one point when she does a kind of endless descents. I would like to play also an endless descent, sort of a style exercise played by the Bavarian radio here, and they sort of mimic an endless descent. And at the end, they mimic also a sound that goes down the scale, but becomes gradually higher. Becomes finally higher, sorry. Wind. Bids. Okay, now this is a passage of stable harmony, and then a descent which ends up higher. Etc. And so there are all kinds of ways back between electronics and or computer sounds and instruments. And composers like Xenakis or Ligeti or Penderecki acknowledge that the experience of electronic music was very important to them, and Ligeti himself followed the experiments on the computer very much, and he was inspired by them in several of his pieces, like, for example, several of the etudes, where he used stream segregation, circularity of pitch, and other perceptual features that are not obvious at all from the physical structure. Now, I want to speak at length with the concept, which is extremely important, of auditory scene analysis, which Albert Brickman developed, and which Steve McAdams also furthered with the how do you discriminate simultaneous sounds, which, well, maybe I'll play just a fragment of the beginning of Phone by John Chowning, where he has metamorphosis of sounds. That is, you have bell-like sounds that will gradually sound like, enrich themselves and sound like voices by a fine modulation. And at the end of this passage of 1 minute that I'll play, there is a kind of mass of sounds, magma. And out of this magma, John Chowning makes certain figures emerge, like in particular voice-like tones, which are like basso profondissimo, very deep basses. And this he does by slightly manipulating by slightly making a micro modulation, a small modulation, synchronous for a number of components. Now, if this happens, there is a similar phenomenon in vision. If many components have so common fate, as the Gestalt psychologists said, then the ear will tend to attach these components together and treat them as a single entity. Let's say, for example, a tone with its harmonics, or inharmonics, as a matter of fact. It helps fusion to have harmonics, but you can have bell-like sounds. And so we'll hear this passage, which sort of takes advantage of this feature. This, by the way, explains how we can sort out tones in unison, or for that matter, even tones at periodic tones which are situated at harmonic intervals. And of course, this is not obvious when you hear several signals together, several sound signals like sine wave. Are you going to hear them as a single entity or as a chord, for example? This is a question I briefly mentioned before, and this is, of course, the auditory scene organization, which is not done arbitrarily, but as Albert Brickman showed, and I must say our experiments with sound also confirm this, that is, they are very useful to sort out and to make sense, to extract useful information about the word from the auditory signals. I'll just give two examples. One is, for example, John Chowning can make the sound recede in the distance, not by simply diminishing the amplitude, which makes the sound softer, but by controlling the amount of direct sound to reverberated. The reverberated tend to be constant, and our ear doesn't have to make this explicit. She recognizes that the sound is far away because there is more of the reverberated sound than if it were close by. I mean, there is a larger proportion, rather. The sound, direct sound diminishes with distance, but not the reverberated sound in most enclosure, not very much at least. And in fact, when you hear a sound on the radio, for example, you put the radio very low because it's late at night, and you hear a trombone, and you hear, oh, he's playing very loud. But the level is very low, but you can still recognize, partly because there is this important feature that with the brass, the louder, the brighter. And so you can sort of sort out these effects and have understanding about the word that's just incredibly sophisticated, and I don't know of any program that can do the same kind of sorting that the ears of men or animals do. So let me play this beginning of phone with Metamorphosis and yeah. Voices. Now, I mentioned the interest of mixed pieces, and this is still another example where the voice of the singer Irene Jarsky will dialogue with a tape. And at some point, the sound of the tape become sort of voice-like by doing this kind of trembling, which Mike McNabb and John Chowning have developed for suggesting a voice-like sound, even though the imitation is physically crude, but convincing to the ear insofar that it sounds like, you know, the kind of gait, l'allure of a vocal sound. So here we have the singer who sings with tones from the synthesized tone, and all of a sudden she says, quelque chose ici n'est pas de ce monde, someone here is not of this world. And in fact, it's synthesis of voices, but of voices of persons who do not exist, so you cannot relate to them. And so this is this passage. Anonymous sound. And this is what you might call encounters of the third kind. There is physical contact in the air, but of course of two words, one of which doesn't have a material counterpart that can be seen or touched. Okay, now I will still illustrate two aspects. One is digital sound processing. Digital sound processing means modifying the sound with a computer, and this is to synthesis what musique concrète is to electronic music, because musique concrète is manipulating recorded sound. And of course, the computer can do so with all the resources of the precision of the computer, but also very, very elaborate techniques. And here, for example, among the many talented researchers in this center, we have Philippe de Pal, who I knew for a long time in IRCAM, and he is, of course, a master in digital processing. And you can do, for example, things similar to what you do with synthesis by doing analysis and resynthesis. For example, you can slow down recorded utterance without changing the pitch with certain limits. And so the processing, musique concrète, I myself didn't do very much until I had a commission from GRM. GRM is a group de recherche musicale in Paris, now directed by Daniel Teruggi before François Bell, and initially founded by Pierre Schaeffer within the French radio. It was the birthplace of the musique concrète. And I had a commission, and I had long thought that in the analog domain, I was frustrated to some extent by both musique concrète, because it lacked the ductility of sound transformation that you could achieve with synthesis or instruments, and by electronic music, because it was so dull. But I thought perhaps if you make a kind of marriage between the two, you can perhaps animate the electronic synthetic sound with energy fluxes extracted from the acoustic sounds, like the wind, the sea, the birds. But also you could control the you could control the electronics. Yeah, you could exert control over the acoustic sounds with these elaborate techniques, which are not always easy to use, but sometimes it's fairly easy. So I will go to give a few examples, and then I will conclude with a brief demonstration on this interactive piano. Excuse me, I'm not so careful about this microphone, but okay, so I decided to do a piece with acoustic material, recording from the sea, birds, soundscapes, little instruments, and electronic sounds, computer synthesized sounds, and, excuse me. And so I could do recordings like a photography, choosing my subject and the magnification, the focus. A microphone is like a microscope for sound. But yeah, and I can do all kind of transformation. But I decided to have a found object, a recording of the sea one day in Marseille. I decided to use this found object as a kind of germinal motif that I would have recur over the piece. I would even use it metaphorically as a kind of origin of form, shape, and do various transformations that I will briefly enumerate. I mean, I describe some of them. So let's see. So I used also sounds of the sea, and you may remember I used this tone of 55 hertz, and then I added copies with very close frequencies. What happens if I do this small change of frequency with a sound that is not periodical, like the sound of a rough sea in Marseille by Mistral weather? Well, if I mixed now, maybe you expected this. I certainly didn't. And in fact, the explanation is a little more complicated than with periodic sound. It has to do with loss of coherence of random, of noises. Anyway, that was such an event that I encountered by just trying things. You know, I didn't anticipate it, and so I decided to make it a central movement based on this, and I decided to do a movement with a metaphorical tempest, finishing by a wreckage. Anyway, but initially I had simply thought of gradually merging the acoustic and electronic sound by introducing some aspects of one into the other, as I will also demonstrate with a couple of examples. For example, I extracted from this germinal motif certain curves that take in account both the amplitude evolution and also the brightness evolution, the spectral center of gravity, kind of. So when I transpose a percussive sound that played first, along this curve, I get kind of a more energetic, so this is the initial percussive sound. I transposed copies following this contour. So well, to me it sounds as though some of the energy of the wave is sort of acting on the synthesized sounds. Now, I also use the scale that is non-octaviating. It's a kind of minor major plus F sharp. I mean, this is a scale. This I imprinted voluntarily by, on the synthetic sounds. Oops, sorry. but the natural sound, they are what they are, like the bird sings what they want. The sea doesn't, I mean, it can sing, but it doesn't have definite pitch. Okay, now I wanted to first use this sort of to marry, not mix, but really incorporate the scale to quantify those curves. So the curve is determined by the flux of the wave, but when I try to quantify, that is, when this curve, which I use as a frequency controlling curve, reaches one of the steps of the scale, okay, we play that note until we reach the next step, and we play that note. So instead of having glissandi, we have steps. Now, the melody depends on at which time, where the curve intersects the grid of pitches, and the speed depends on the proximity of pitches, but also of the slope of the curve. Like here, it's very long note because the curve is almost stationary. Now, I say animals do what they are used to, or what they want. Crickets in Marseille in June sing in F sharp, but you can transpose them so that they conform to the scale F sharp. Okay, now these germinal motifs that I mentioned, you can filter according to the mode. So C sounds have no pitch, but okay, here you have the harmony from the scale that is animated by the waves of the sea. And using, again, this kind of hybrids, you can make, okay, I can filter a bird song so that he will sing only, or at least only this part of the song that resonates to the scale will be heard. That's a kind of bird raga. Etc. And I can do such textures by mixing the striations, the glissandi. Etc. And I can do cross-synthesis, which is this is very sophisticated processing. But you can analyze a sound in terms of its excitation and response. So, for example, you can sort of the excitation of a cello and the response of birds. You have a kind of bird cello, sustained tone, but so the idea is not so much to make chimeras, but rather to sort of hybridize acoustic sounds and control sounds so that the control of the sounds, synthetic sound, can be imprinted onto the natural sound, and the energy fluxes of the natural sound can come to animate the synthetic sounds. And this, of course, I like to read that in the letters of Cézanne, who said, I want to unite curves of women with shoulders of hills. Now, Cézanne did his first major paintings in Marseille and then near Montagne Sainte-Victoire, which is a well-known shape. Okay, now I will conclude by just doing a brief explanation of the piano interaction, I'll do it right there at the piano. If I should stop before 6, right? Is that, yeah?
Yes, especially we'd like to get some time for questions, too.
Yes, okay. So I'll be about 10, 12 minutes. Is that okay? Yes. So now, this is not about synthetic sounds. This is about piano sounds, interaction between a performer and a computer program within the acoustic domain. Now, this piano is a commercial piano. It's a Yamaha disc clavier, which is a normal acoustic piano. But it has keys and hammers, but it also has motors and sensors. And the motors, the sensors rather, will, excuse me, I have to revive this computer who is definitely, oh, well, okay. Whenever I play, the piano will send out a MIDI signals that tells at what time the note is played, which key is played, and at what velocity, at what loudness. Now, I can also send MIDI signals to the piano, and so I choose a low level, and I'm going to do, for example, a series of notes ascending. That's a little soft, but you can see that I can animate the piano. Now, if you do a recording of what a pianist played, you can have the identical or quasi-identical, insofar as the piano works mechanically rather well. You can have a reproduction of what was played, but played with the keys moving. I know it's in the acoustic domain. But what I did is not a mere reproduction. I interposed a computer between the output of the computer, which because of the output of the piano, which will tell to the computer what I have played, and the input of the piano fed by a computer program who knows what the pianist is playing and adds an accompaniment as a function of what the pianist has played. For example, there is a well-known Webern piece, the variation number 2, and this is a piece where each note is followed by its mirror image around the central layer of the piano. So that's a very systematic symmetry. And so it's so systematic that I can do it, have the program achieve this symmetry and only play every other note. And it will mirror my performance. And of course, I'm leading the game because I can play. It's really mirroring. So I'm in control, and this is sort of amplifying the game. But I can vary. For example, now there are certain notes, so I decide to have another symmetry. So if I play the beginning, you see, it doesn't. Here is the center. So I can do other things. Now with a longer delay. You see, this symmetry is almost visible. Now, this is a very simple transformation. That's inversion of intervals. Another one is extension, which, translation is like transposition. And so you can clearly amplify the piano, like I did before with a fractalization. But, so this is a way to amplify the piano. You can make also the accompaniment to be sensitive to what the pianist plays and how he or she plays. And for instance, in that piece, well, let's see. Now, I play. It will play. So it's waiting for me. It's holding this resonance. Now I play three notes. It does a fast accompaniment. Now if I reiterate these little notes and play it slower, it will politely slow down as I did. And so it's really following. And I have other processes that I will very briefly illustrate. One is the use of the resonant aspect of the piano, which is used in a number of contemporary pieces. And the third pedal is a way to make a selective resonance, not only like the pedal sustain. And so you can have certain resonances that are sustained. The third pedal, by the way, you have only 2 feet, which is too bad when you play the third pedal, the soft, the sordino, and the sustain. So let's see. And then you can change harmony, etc. at the just by. So it will play what you programmed in the first place. You can also. Tomorrow I'll play 4 of these examples that are pieces. I'll play. Just give a short presentation of 2 of them still. One I call metronome. And this illustrates the capacity of the program to accompany and play at different tempi. So at the beginning, for example, I will play melodies, and it will listen to these melodies and play transposed version faster. And this is, by the way, a warning for the real-time people who are among us, I think. Real time is great, but if it's playing faster than I am, it will catch up with me. And then you'll have to predict what I have to do. So, I mean, real time, you know, it's very difficult also to do, comment est-ce qu'on dit, retrogradation, time retrogradation in real time, evidently. Anyway. So it's playing 2 tempi at the same time, and this is a strong feature of the program Max MSP by Miller-Puckett. Now it's my turn. Now it's playing 3 tempi. Now 3 tempi. And then I'm going to decide myself the metronomic tempo, not in the program. I will decide the. Now a second metronomic tempo. Another one. Etc. And so Ligeti has done a symphonic poem for 100 metronomes, and they gradually extinguish because the spring unwinds, but here there is no spring, so it can last indefinitely if you don't know the cue to escape. Now the last example I will give, and I think I'll be, is that example of an arpeggio, okay. I'll play this piece tomorrow, but I'll just show the idea here. It's, okay. Well, it doesn't do anything until I play a certain note. Now, if I play, it will play an arpeggio of fifths, except the louder I play, the faster Okay, well, I'll stop here, but the piece lasts longer, of course. Well, thank you very much. I think I have no real conclusion, but what I didn't emphasize, because I spoke a lot at the first person, but of course, each musician, when he commits himself to a given piece, he commits himself. But there is a community of users that work hand in hand, I should say, with musical creation and research. And I hope this is furthering the possibilities and making them more varied, but also more congenial, perhaps, to our senses, I would say, because, again, that's our view of the world. And, of course, yesterday it was discussed whether using these extreme features of perception was, like illusions, or somewhat said magic, illusionist, and indeed there is some aspect of magic in music. It's a different word, but it's perhaps a more appealing word. So thank you. Thank you.